Hello and welcome to the AI Show, brought to you by Lenovo. I'm your host, Emily Barrett, and I'm thrilled to be your guide through the fascinating world of artificial intelligence. In each episode, we'll deep dive into the AI universe, exploring the latest innovations, the people behind them, and how these technologies are shaping our future. On this episode, I'll be joined by Jim Liddle from Nasuni, and we'll be discussing the use of AI in the enterprise. So let's begin as we take you on our journey through the world of AI. Hi, Jim. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for coming on. So we start by getting our guests to introduce themselves a little bit. So do you mind sharing a little bit about your background, how you've ended up working in AI, where you've come from, those kinds of things?
Sure. So right now I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for Nasuni, as you said. Nasuni provides a hybrid cloud data management platform. I've been with Nasuni now 2 years, almost to the day actually. My company, thank you very much. My company was acquired by Nasuni. So I was the CEO and founder of a company called Storage Made Easy. We did federated data storage, but we didn't store any data. We indexed the data to allow you to get a federated view of it, and then provided some utilities on top. And Nasuni bought that company 2 years ago. And since then, I've been working there, which has been great. Prior to that, I worked for American startup companies and Israeli startup companies. So I've worked in kind of big data, and I've worked in things like business processes, business rules, NLP. So I had kind of an early foray into some of early, machine learning, AI type technologies. And we used some of those principles when we were at Storage Made Easy. We did some early AI work there. We did some early search index work. And that's kind of how I fell into it, if you like.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is actually hearing from people how they've ended up working in AI. And with the exception of a few people, the majority of people have come at things from this is the problem I have. What tools can I use to fix that problem? And AI happens to be one of those tools, and then they've just kind of fallen into it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think, I think the interest was spiked when I was working in the business process, business rules technology, when you could see that where the kind of the model was the code type of routine. And you could see that by being declarative, you could achieve a lot. And that, for me, that was what spiked the early interest. And really, it was from there that I kind of kept an eye on the space, even sometimes on a personal level when I wasn't using it at work. So.
Yeah, and so at the moment, obviously, we're having a bit of an AI moment.
Of course.
And we are definitely riding that hype wave. But I think one of the things, and we were just chatting before this, that a lot of people don't realise is where enterprises are at in terms of AI adoption. So do you want to explain a little bit about your view of the world in terms of where, do all enterprises have AI? Is everybody using it? Or are we, still at that early adoption stage? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, we are at the early adoption stage, definitely in the enterprise. There's a, classic Gartner hype cycle thing going on right now. And I think we're definitely in the hype phase. In terms of AI, we probably need to break it down between, machine learning, AI, Gen AI. I mean, I think there's always been a smattering of companies who've used machine learning, for example, either in their products or, because they've built something that makes more sense for them internally to solve a problem. I think Gen AI is, where the real upsell is right now in terms of what the AI community is pushing. And I think that's what really has been latched onto by the enterprise, because they can look at it and they can see it solves a lot of problems. In terms of its use, I think right now it's really early. There are lots of reasons for that. Firstly, Gen AI is still quite immature in terms of how long it's been with us. 18 months, 2 years since we really had OpenAI release, GPT-3. And I think that's one of the problems actually. The whole model paradigm and how quickly it's moving, it's very difficult to get a handle on something solid to roll out, because then the next model's coming out. I mean, it was only 2 months ago that OpenAI retired GPT-3, and if you kind of dipped your toe in the waters early and you did maybe some fine tuning or some work around that, you kind of have to do the whole thing again on a new model. And that's problematic inside of the enterprise. That kind of quick change life cycle management is a problem. The other issue is around things like security, skill sets. There's a lot of reasons why it's still early in the adoption cycle, but there's a lot of excitement about it. And I think where it is being used, it's where it's easy to use. So things like chatbots, that you can deploy, fairly easily, either through applications or through things like Copilot.
Yeah.
And also where it's embedded in tool sets that you use or workflows. So things like GitHub Copilot, where it can be kind of an aid memoir to something that you're already doing as a workflow. Those types of things have been definitely embraced. But some of I would say more of the use cases around, domain data, ontology data that the enterprise, holds, a lot of that hasn't been cracked right now, I would say. Although, there's certainly, the enterprise wants to.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, I talk to enterprises a lot who are going, I've got all this data, I want to do something with it. I know I've got some insights there, but it's the how they get to that point. So what do you see as those main barriers to enterprises actually being able to get value from the data that they may think they have, but actually don't have, or, any of those caveats?
Yeah, well, if you look at the data inside of an enterprise, I guess you can take it as, you can divide it in two halves: structured data, unstructured data. Structured data, they've had a handle on for a while, and that actually have been, tools and ways in which they can leverage that data. And, I think that's kind of put to bed. They know how to do that. Unstructured data is, something completely different.
Yeah.
PowerPoints, PDFs, Word documents, all the digitalization things that we have. That data set is really large. I mean, for example, we've got customers with hundreds of terabytes of data or petabytes of data, of unstructured data. Gartner refers to that as dark data that goes dark pretty quickly. And I think the stat is if you don't use it within 60 days, you might not use it again very quickly at all. But it still has tons of value, not only from the point of view of it has data points for you in the enterprise, but you want to be able to use it to be able to point to something new in terms of what it can provide you, correlations of what you've been working on over a period of time. Those data sets are hard to get a handle on, and part of the issue for that is unstructured data itself. The formats of unstructured data are all over the place, Word documents, PDFs, images, videos. There isn't a cohesive format, and that's always been a barrier. Even for the search players, that's a barrier. When you look at visibility of data, typically that was a search problem. How do I search my unstructured data sets? And I don't think that was ever really cracked well, to be honest with you. If you look at some of those traditional search products, the kind of BM25 search products, they worked well to an extent, but there was still a barrier to entry. Data sets are large. How do you continually index? Can it support all the file formats that I have in my enterprise? If it can support all the file formats, is it really useful to me to have context? And I think those are some of the barriers to entry, the ability to get the visibility into the data set, not just to get it into something like AI, but to have enough visibility to kind of curate it and clean it up, to get it into the right format, to get it into AI.
Yeah, and I think though, it's those pre-existing steps that sometimes people don't realise need to be taken to actually be able to get use out of that data. People go, well, I've got this data, I just want to throw an AI at it.
Well, we talked earlier, didn't we?
We did.
We see in the enterprise that people sometimes go, they kind of put a label, data plus AI equals value. And then they ignore all the steps in between. That needs to be done to get there.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think this is where speaking to somebody who has done this before can be really helpful.
Totally agree,
from an enterprise perspective, because there is more to it than just, hey, I've got some data.
There is. I mean, there are some actual other challenges, such as where is your data set? Where is your unstructured data set?
Yeah.
Is it all kind of corralled together so that it's unified, or is it sat on different silos that are not? Do you really want to have to do an infrastructure integration project before you can actually start to think about having a unified data set? Yeah. And enterprises do have those challenges.
Yeah.
It's particularly with unstructured data. There might be, legacy infrastructure, legacy Windows filers, FTP servers, all that whole data sets that give context to other information that really you want to go through a project to rationalize and coalesce.
Yeah, and I think that's really key, is being able to do that gathering of that data so that you know what you've got, where you've got it, and what steps you need to take in order to get that into shape, right? It's doing that assessment of where am I now? What steps do I need to take to get to where I need to be before I can actually implement this project? Because, we talk about the data issue, but there are other things in this as well, right? Yes, okay, a lot of when we're talking about any form of processing, we need to talk about that data as well, but
Sure.
there are tools you need to be able to actually process that data too. There are skill sets you need to be able to process that data. Do you have those people? Do you have those tools? If you don't have them, what's your plan for getting them? Are you buying those in? What are you doing here? Are you hiring people? So there's a whole strategy thing to think about when we start
I agree.
talking about how you do this.
We kind of have a saying that to have an AI strategy, you really need a good data strategy.
Yeah, 100%.
That's kind of our moniker, to be honest with you. If you don't have a good data strategy, even though you might be able to knock off some very light AI use cases, long term, you won't have a cohesive AI strategy.
Yeah, and I think this, a few years ago, when I first started working in the IT industry, people were talking about big data and how do we, we've got these data lakes, and how do we deal with all of this unstructured data that we've got? The amount of data that people are generating has continued to increase.
Oh, hugely, especially since COVID.
Yeah, it's not going down, right? It's only ever going up. So making sure that you have that really clear data strategy that is not just a nice piece of paper somewhere, but that is actually implemented, is going to form key parts of businesses going forward. And I think this is where we'll start really seeing that differentiation between enterprises who can use the data they've got and enterprises who have some data somewhere, but they can't actually make any use of it because
can't access it, can't really leverage it from an AI
exactly
perspective.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when you think about unstructured data and you think about the enterprise mindset around that, it really was, up until recently, I think it was more the thought process about it being a cost to be managed. How much is it costing me to store my unstructured data? Heard that so many times, over the years. But I think it's changed now. I think people are looking at it and not just thinking about cost, they're thinking about how can I leverage the data that I store, not just how much does it cost me.
And how do I get value out of it?
Exactly, yeah. And that's interesting because it's kind of changed from that cost to be managed to asset to be leveraged.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I think there's still an element of people wanting to manage the cost, but drag as much value as possible.
But good question. I mean, I get asked questions now like, should we really archive our data or should we leave it around in case we want to do any model training or use it in some other way? So people's thought processes are starting to change around those data sets.
Yeah, and I think, that is key. People do think, oh, well, what if I want to train on this data? How do I store it in a way that means that when I can access it?
Good example. If you start to put it on like kind of frozen cloud storage, how much is it going to cost you to get it back out to be able to then leverage it to train a data set?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to people who have put data up in the cloud and are now going, yeah, I've put that data up in the cloud and I want to train on it. But it's an expensive thing to do to get your data back down.
Instead of an archive tier now, you can kind of think of it as an AI tier almost.
Yeah, and I think that does it requires a little bit of a change of mindset from people. But people are starting to think about that now. They're starting to think, oh, well, what if I do want to use this technology? How can I drive value out of this data, rather than just store it? And I think especially when we look at some of the highly regulated industries where they have to store data for set periods of time.
Yeah, 7 years, 11 years.
Exactly. They can stop that just being a cost and actually start to drive value if they're able to utilise that data.
I think that's true. I mean, I think we're starting to see that when you see some of the licensing deals on data sets that have been done recently. Some of those licensing deals, obvious ones like WordPress and Reddit and Twitter, but a lot of data is getting locked down. So it's becoming much more difficult now to train new foundational models on data sets because the data sets are not available. And I think what we'll start to see is some of those foundational models will be able to leverage domain data. And it makes more sense for them to leverage domain data in many ways because once that data is trained and it ends up in kind of that parametric store, that's really where all your biases and everything else come in. So if you're doing it against your own domain data and you're not really relying on the foundational model data, in some ways you're in a much better place, long term.
Yeah, you're going to end up with something that is much more representative of what
Exactly.
your business actually is, rather than something that is more generic.
Well, you spend a lot of time trying to tune out the biases or work around the biases, or actually not really understand the biases in many cases, because people talk about like open source LLMs, but it's not really, open source is a kind of a funny term because it's open source, but it's not really open weights, because in many cases you don't get the model weights and the training data with it. And if you don't have that, you're still in the same position.
Yeah, and this, this brings us onto the explainability thing that we were again talking about a bit earlier. That actually, if you don't understand that, and if you don't understand where your model is getting its information from, if you don't understand why it's coming out with the things it's doing, how do you manage that as an enterprise? Because it's one thing to, ask ChatGPT a question on a personal level and get given an incorrect answer, right? It's another thing for an enterprise to build a campaign or put out something into the public domain, which is potentially damaging or incorrect because their internal tooling has given them that answer. So explainability becomes really important to understand what it is that model is doing.
And the reality is of course, with foundational models, you don't really get explainability in terms of the answer set. That's why like retrieval augmented generation, or RAGs, proved more popular in some cases, because you can externalize the domain data or the ontology, and then you can, use that as the reference point, for the data set that ultimately is consumed by the prompt, then pass it back to the LLM to get it to use that data to give you the answer. And in some ways that's become kind of the de facto model in some ways for the enterprise. Actually, to hive off what you've just talked about, which is don't really want to use the foundational model, want to use my own domain data, want to limit hallucinations, and want to be able to get an answer that I can rely on.
Yeah, and I think that's so key, I think, for enterprises going forwards. And I think it's one of the big concerns that a lot of enterprises do have is, can I rely on this? And how do I know I can rely on this? Yeah.
Like if it's only 84% accurate, that kind of, it's 84% accurate.
That's really great, but it's
60% inaccurate. And
exactly.
Like enterprises can work on that basis.
Yeah. So it is interesting. And I think also getting people to that understanding of, well, okay, things aren't 100% accurate all the time. You can close that inaccuracy gap, but it's never going to be 100%.
It's not, unless you go to a more, what I would call a narrow AI focus.
Yeah.
And I can see that's going to happen, actually. We've seen some smaller models. I think Microsoft's Phi series is a kind of good example of that. Some of the open source smaller models are other good examples of that. And I think in some cases, smaller models trained on,
very specific
things for very specific use cases. I can see that being very applicable inside of the enterprise. You can knock off some really nice departmental use cases in that way, without having kind of a wide model with potentially lots of biases with unknown training data.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point to be making here. There are other options out there. There are these narrow things starting to emerge that actually might be more appropriate for enterprises to look at than some of the more general stuff.
Yeah, I mean, part of you mentioned earlier, part of the challenges with the enterprise. I think part of the challenges has been to get their arms around it. And, we talked about earlier how many enterprises are really going to do model training, how many enterprises are really going to do fine tuning. And we both kind of said to each other, in our experience, not a lot, a smaller percentage, a very small percentage. And I think what we're kind of seeing now in the industry, and I think the bigger players like OpenAI have been responsible for this, is kind of the democratisation of AI to an API.
Yeah.
So that actually you don't need to have data science teams. If you want to use AI, you can encapsulate that into your kind of dev team, and they can start to focus down on really understanding the APIs for that model. And I've definitely seen some of that, within where I work.
Yeah, and it's absolutely true. You can now access more of this capability more easily without having to have those specialist skills within your organisation that you might have had to have previously. But equally, just to echo back to what we were just saying, it is really important that you understand what it is
Absolutely.
you're calling on, what it is you're
Absolutely.
using, what is sitting underneath that API. You
Get back
do
to the
need-
foundational. Do you understand the training?
Precisely.
Data, etc.
So I think there is as much as it's being made easier, I think there's a risk that we start forgetting there's a risk we start forgetting the risks, but that's a lot of use of the word.
Yeah. There's a quote I heard the other day: AI safety is not a model property, which I think is absolutely true.
I mean, yeah, it's something that you need to be thinking about every single step when you're using it, right?
Yeah, all the way through. From prompts that users can use and the responses that they get, to the biases we just talked about, to the hallucinations, to what happens. I mean, we saw recently that there was a problem. I think Hugging Face took a step and said that they'd found a bad actor inside their ecosystem. So if you're using models from a cloud vendor where something like that happens, you have to have controls and monitoring in place. Yeah. So it's a whole ecosystem of safety.
Yeah, absolutely is. And I think actually, it isn't necessarily that different to how you'd implement things in any other area of your technology stack,
yeah, I agree.
Right? So this is stuff that enterprises should know and should be familiar with. But I think it's the people that are coming at this might be slightly different. So within organizations, you wouldn't necessarily, it isn't always the IT department, right, who are looking at using AI for something, and the expertise on how to navigate security within technology generally, let's face it, sits within the IT or technology department, not within the line of business. And I think it's just reminding people that actually a level of collaboration is needed here to make sure that everybody is doing things safely and to minimize risk.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a big difference between prototyping and productionizing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have tried to run fast. A lot of worry inside of organizations on whether they're missing the AI boat, and even if they're not deploying things, wanting to get busy, to start to learn essentially and bed it down in their organization. But running fast has its own challenges, particularly when it comes to safety and security.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Jim. This has been really, really interesting. I think we probably could have talked for far longer than we have, but really appreciate you coming on the show. And thank you to everybody who has watched. We hope to see you again soon.